for yet another YouTube Live. I'm going to give people a few minutes to sign on here, but tonight I'm going to be talking about two persons of interest, two suspects, whatever you want to call them, that have been pretty pivotal in my research investigations in the D.B. Cooper case over the years, and that's Sheridan Peterson and also Vince Petersen. They're not related, even though the last names sound the same. They are spelled slightly differently. They're not related, but just coincidentally, they're two of the people that I've spent an enormous amount of time looking into. So I'm going to give people a few minutes to sign on here to hook up with us. And then I'll go into talking about both Sheridan Peterson and Vince Petersen, and in particularly what intrigued me about these two men as, you know, prospective D.B. Coopers, I guess is probably the way to put it there. So any case, like I said, I'll give a few minutes here, a couple minutes here for people to sign to sign on board here, and then we'll just take it away. A little bit of a cough here. It's not a good way to start, so let me adjust this camera a little bit here while people sign on here. So, boy, I need a water, but any case, or a beer or something like that, scotch, wine, something like that. So how about we give it another 60 seconds or so. Hi, Jay. How you doing? We'll give another 60 seconds or so, and then we'll go ahead and pick this thing up. And feel free to plug in your comments there. You know, I'll try to catch them as they pop up and answer questions, answer questions as they come up. But if I can talk. So, hey, Mark, how you doing? Hopefully I don't need my little readers here. I've got my readers here. I better put on the side here in case I need those. But all right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here with this YouTube Live here. First of all, right out of the gate, I want to kind of say that coming up this Thursday, I'm actually going to be doing another YouTube Live regarding a very big development concerning Oak Ridge National Laboratory. There's some information that I've come into or come across or been working on or developing over the last little bit with respect to this, and in particular, I've got an uncle who's a nuclear engineer who has colleagues who worked at Oak Ridge. So what I've done is I actually provided the particle data from the latest retesting of stub 675 that came from the tie, and had them look at it, had my uncle look at it, who's a nuclear engineer, and also he had his colleague look at it. And they made some, they've got some pronouncements, or they made some comments with respect to that. So it's actually a pretty big deal as far as Oak Ridge is concerned, and that I am going to be addressing this Thursday, the same time as this event. In other words, 6 p.m. Pacific time, or 9 p.m. Eastern time if you're on the East Coast, which I am in the beautiful state of Rhode Island. So that's the first thing I want to get out of the way here. So the other thing I want to talk about here, or let's just get right into this here, talking about this, is two of the people that, as many of you know, I've followed pretty diligently over the last several years. And this is these two gentlemen here. Obviously, the gentleman with the white background over here, that's Sheridan Peterson, and then the gentleman closest to me is Vince Petersen. Now, I want to say that with these YouTube Lives, it's all mirror imaged, so everything is kind of reversed. So it's as if you're kind of looking at me as well as their images in a mirror. It's just worth noting. Not that it's materially important, but that's just something that I want to point out there. But so yeah, these two gentlemen here. Now, Sheridan Peterson, let's start with Sheridan Peterson. Sheridan Peterson came to my attention really very early on. When I first got involved with this investigation, with this case, I firmly believe that the FBI had probably come across the real D.B. Cooper at some point in time. I believe that D.B. Cooper was actually probably one of those, 1,000 men that the FBI had investigated. They just couldn't put a finger on the guy. They couldn't prove that any of them were D.B. Cooper. But, we've all heard of those cold cases that get solved after 30, 40 years, usually through DNA testing, only to find out that the culprit, who ends up getting caught 30 or 40 years later, was actually somebody who was on law enforcement's radar all along. And, so then there are many examples of that. So I kind of thought, I bet you the same sort of thing is at play here, because I always felt like the FBI in particular was sniffing around the right areas, sniffing around the right circles. In other words, I thought Boeing and the aerospace sector and the parachuting clubs and that kind of thing, I thought, that's exactly where you need to be looking. And, there were a lot of men that they looked at that, either worked at Boeing or used to work at Boeing or had some sort of relationship to Boeing or were involved in skydiving clubs or what have you. And I thought, there's a really, really good chance that the real D.B. Cooper is buried in those FBI files somewhere. So with that in mind, I actually started digging into the files, and this was several years ago. Of course, the names are redacted, and so you don't know who you're reading about, but I had a pretty good idea of who I was looking for. So I started reading through the files and eventually came across a person that was of particular interest to me. And there was enough information there in the files where I could sort of figure out who it was, and it ended up being Sheridan Peterson. Now, Sheridan Peterson was actually one of the very first suspects that the FBI started digging into within a week of the skyjacking. So this was right out of the gate. He was immediately on their radar. And how he got on their radar is he actually, at the time of the skyjacking, he was no longer working at Boeing, because Sheridan Peterson did work at Boeing formally from 1962 to 1964. He worked in the technical documents division. In other words, he worked in a division where they actually wrote technical documents, essentially, as Sheridan put it to me. And I did talk with Sheridan on several occasions. So I did know Sheridan, did speak with him on several occasions. He has since passed. He passed in January 2021. But the way he explained it to me is that his job was to basically take this very technical stuff that the engineers designed and put together and sort of, for lack of a better word, kind of dumb it down so that the people on the assembly floor who were assembling these things knew what to do, knew how to build one of these jets, which is obviously a pretty big undertaking, a massive deal. So, and I don't want to suggest that the guys on the floor are idiots or whatever. I'm just saying that he had to grossly simplify the stuff, you get rid of all the technical jargon and everything, and make it easy for the people on the floor to actually know what the hell to do as far as assembling these jets and everything. So Sheridan was intimately involved with, for example, the Boeing 727, because the 727 was being tested and the prototype and everything was coming out right in that exact same time frame that Sheridan started working there, beginning in 1962. Ultimately, the 727 entered service on February 1st, 1964, and Sheridan left Boeing right around in 1964, somewhere around that time frame. I'm not exactly sure when in 64 he left, but he was there from 62 to 64. So, but what I'm getting at here is that in 1971, obviously he had been gone at that point for 7 years, probably closer to 8 years, because this took place at the end of 71. And there was a former colleague of Sheridan's at Boeing who contacted the FBI and says, that sketch looks like this guy that I used to work with at Boeing. I can't remember his name or whatever, but basically, at least I don't think he could remember the name. Maybe he could. I'd have to refresh my memory. But nonetheless, That's how Sheridan Peterson was introduced to the FBI. So the FBI started looking into Sheridan Peterson, but they couldn't figure out where the hell he was. They even went as far as reaching out to his ex-wife and his ex-father-in-law, who at that time lived in Montana. And basically, essentially, they were able to put together that Sheridan was now living overseas in Asia. And they weren't exactly sure where in Southeast Asia, but he was living somewhere in Asia. He had been in Vietnam, and they kind of knew that. And he wasn't fighting in Vietnam. He was there as a refugee advisor, but that's all they kind of knew. So the FBI was obviously really interested in Sheridan Peterson, but they just there's just not much they could really kind of glean from him because he was overseas. And what's interesting in the documentation is there comes a point, well, I want to back up and say that not too long after, as they were digging into Sheridan Peterson, that's when Richard Floyd McCoy skyjacked the jet in wherever the hell it was. He jumped out over Provo, Utah, near Provo, Utah. And all of a sudden, you could tell that the FBI just all of a sudden everybody was focused on Richard Floyd McCoy because they're thinking this had to be the guy. Did something very similar, kind of resembles the sketch, and it kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room there for a period of time, as the FBI, and it's obvious their resources and manpower were being spent kind of digging into Richard Floyd McCoy. Well, eventually they realized McCoy's not the guy. He's simply not the guy, and he was ultimately eliminated as a suspect. And they kind of got back to work with Sheridan Peterson and some other people that they had been looking at. And it got to a point with Sheridan Peterson where they said, what we're going to do is there's no sense going any further with trying to dig any more into this guy's background or whatever until we actually have the flight attendants take a look at his image, his photo. And it may be this photo here. This may have been one of the photos they looked at. I'm not really sure, but they basically said, before we go any further, let's see what the flight attendants say. If they say there's no way in hell he was the guy, then then I guess it goes without saying that's probably as far as their investigation will go. And then there's this lull that goes on for a few months, a handful of months. Obviously, the flight attendants hadn't looked at the images or the picture of Sheridan Peterson, whatever. Then all of a sudden, I want to say it was about 1974, a few years later, all of a sudden it picks up again. I think it was 74, somewhere around there. I have to refresh my memory. But all of a sudden it picks up again, and the FBI is digging in earnest, looking into Sheridan Peterson, and they're going all out, trying to find out information on him. And that's interesting because I took that as a sign of, well, the flight attendants must have seen the picture of Sheridan Peterson based upon the, last correspondence or the last stuff written in the files, and they must have said something to the effect that there's enough of a resemblance or resembles the guy or whatever to pique the interest of the FBI, whereby they started reinvestigating Sheridan Peterson and digging into Sheridan Peterson. So either way, that's what happens. They go ahead and look into Sheridan Peterson, and ultimately they basically kind of put that on ice until the early 2000s. Then in the early 2000s, with the advent of DNA testing, the FBI decides that there are, I believe it's 8 men that they couldn't fully eliminate, 8 men that they hadn't eliminated as suspects related to the D.B. Cooper case. And again, this was in about 2001. I think this was 2001. So at this point, the case is ice cold because it's obviously a 30-year case at this point. So they launched this thing, this FBI launched this thing called the DNA Initiative, and they took a look at D.B. Cooper's tie. They did some DNA analysis, and apparently came away with a partial DNA profile for D.B. Cooper. I don't know what part of the tie they tested. I'm not exactly sure what they did. There's nothing in the documentation that clearly spells that out. But nonetheless, the FBI seemed to be reasonably confident that they had a partial DNA profile for DB Cooper, and there may have been a couple other profiles as well, and they figured one of them was DB Cooper, which is all you really need. Because if you've got three profiles and you don't know if any of them are DB Cooper or not, but they're on the tie in some way, and if at some point in time somebody comes along and matches one of those three profiles, well, obviously you've got to ask a question. How did this dude get his DNA on DB Cooper's tie? If he wasn't an FBI agent or, something like that, then obviously he must have been the guy. So it's not like you have to know exactly which one of the profiles was DB Cooper for it to be very valuable. So the part of the DNA initiative involved actually getting DNA from these 8 guys, some of whom were no longer alive, and Richard Floyd McCoy was one of them that they attempted or were interested in getting DNA from, and they were unsuccessful. But the other 7 men they did, including Sheridan Peterson. And even though this thing was started up in 2001, it got delayed for a few years. In other words, it wasn't until 2004 that they actually got to Sheridan Peterson and got his DNA. Now, one may ask, well, why? Why was that? What took them 3 years? Well, there was this little thing called September 11th that happened, and again, chunk, kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room as far as this goes. So, again, starting in 2004, everything kind of sort of gets back to normal as far as that goes. And it was in 2004 when there was a former FBI agent named Mary Jean Fryer who actually visited Sheridan Peterson, who was then obviously an old man living in Santa Rosa, California, and got a chance to interview Sheridan for the first time and also get a DNA sample from him. I'm not sure if it was, if he spit in a cup or if they took blood from a finger. I'm not really sure what happened as far as that goes, but nonetheless, he did provide a sample that they could sequence for DNA. And importantly, Sheridan Peterson said in the interview with Mary Jean Fryer that basically he had no alibi. He said he was in Nepal, living in Nepal at the base of the Himalaya Mountains with his then wife, who had since passed. He said she passed away, and that they were kind of living totally off the grid. I mean, they were like really off the grid, living in a grass hut, literally that kind of thing. I guess probably shitting in the woods or something. So, but either way, the point of the matter is he didn't have an alibi at all. So obviously that's very interesting, but I think the FBI was kind of thinking, the dude is in fucking Nepal, like that's how feasible is it for him to have, jetted to the Pacific Northwest to pull this thing off and everything else. So obviously kind of a stretch, but so they did get the DNA, and they ultimately did, we don't know what they did with it, honestly. Mary Jean Fryer herself says that she has no idea whether they tested it or not. Now, Sheridan quite famously insisted in later years that he was contacted by the FBI, by Mary Jean Fryer specifically, and that she told him that he was eliminated as a suspect, as a person of interest. The DNA had cleared him. But Mary Jean said that's not true because she had no idea what happened. All she did is took the sample and then she sent it off to Quantico, basically RUD, I think is the term that they use, and that's it. It's hands off and kind of a need to know kind of basis. So she has no idea about whether it was even tested, and certainly she has no idea whether he was eliminated or not as a suspect, but she certainly didn't convey that to Sheridan. So that's one of those things whereby, either Sheridan just kind of got his memory and details foggy and didn't understand what the hell was going on, or he was outright lying and misleading people. I really don't know as far as that goes. But that was just one of the things where it was just kind of bizarre as far as Sheridan, because he was very cagey about a lot of this stuff when it came time for people to ask him about whether he was DB Cooper. But what's interesting about the DNA is that in later tranches of FBI files, we've seen the results for some of those men, and they came back as negative. In other words, they were eliminated because of the DNA. There has never been anything in the files that has addressed the results of Sheridan's DNA profile. Nothing at all. There's nothing in there. I've never seen a single thing that says Sheridan Peterson was eliminated or anything about it, which is also very intriguing. So for a number of reasons, I was interested in Sheridan Peterson, not the least of which is there's a physical resemblance. And what I mean by that is, you can see he's got kind of the high forehead and everything else. Now, this picture you're looking at here, I believe, came from '62. So this is 9 years before the skyjacking. And you see he has thin hair. He's thinning on the top of his head. But nonetheless, he's 6'1". He was a smoke jumper. Obviously worked in the technical documents division of Boeing. Didn't have an alibi. Was an expert skydiver and actually sort of batshit fucking crazy as a skydiver. He actually regularly skydived and jumped at Issaquah Skyport, the very place where two of the parachutes that were delivered to DB Cooper that night came from. The two reserve parachutes came from Issaquah Skyport, including the dummy reserve, which, by the way, Sheridan Peterson says he recalls seeing, and he remembers it being daisy chained on the inside, which is a way of sort of aligning the ropes and the shroud line and everything on the inside, which is very interesting because he used to speak like, yeah, that it was daisy chained on the inside and everything else. And it was one of those things where you always kind of wonder, well, how would you know that? Like, unless you were actually DB Cooper and he knew that that was the one, like, why would you know that that was the rig that was actually handed to DB Cooper? So there were things like that that Sheridan said over the years that were just really suspect. It's just kind of bizarre as far as that goes. Now, ultimately, I was, like I said publicly, I was like 98% convinced that Sheridan Peterson was the guy. I was like 98% certain for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that ultimately when we filmed our History Channel show, when I headlined a History Channel show called The Final Hunt for DB Cooper, Sheridan Peterson was the main person of interest that was profiled in the show, and he was actually on the show and interviewed on the show. Well, he actually gave us his passports to view. So we got a chance to look at his passports. He kept everything. He had passports going all the way back to the beginning. What was very, very interesting is that when you're living in Nepal, you had to have a visa to live in Nepal, and you'd have to update that visa every 90 days. So you could see every 3 months there was an updated visa stamp during his time in Nepal. There was, however, one stamp missing for 1 3-month block period of time. And I don't think I need to tell you exactly what block period of time it was, but in case you're like a fucking idiot, it was the block a period of time that exactly correlates with the skyjacking. That stamp is missing. So obviously seeing that just looked really suspicious. So it's almost like it's got me thinking this guy wasn't in Nepal. He can't even prove he was in Nepal. I know he said he was in Nepal, but he can't fucking prove it. If you look at his passport, his visa stamps, it's missing. This stamp is fucking gone. Why would it be gone? Why would that stamp be gone? There's never been a real good explanation that's ever been provided why the stamp is gone. It's crazy. It's really, really bizarre shit. So it got me thinking that, maybe he, flew back. Maybe he flew back on one of those military aircraft transports because he had a relationship with the military as a refugee advisor. There's no, I mean, I think the passport control and all that kind of shit is pretty fucking loose. Maybe he had a fake passport. Who the hell knows? But it got me thinking he could have easily flown back there, pulled this thing off, and flown back to the United States, pulled the thing off, and then after a period of time, flew back to Asia and ultimately Nepal and got a new stamp for his visa and everything else. I don't know. The other thing that's very interesting is that Sheridan Peterson admitted to having a numbered bank account, a secret bank account, kind of like you hear about in Switzerland, how people have numbered bank accounts when they want complete anonymity, like whose account it is, who owns the account. Sheridan admitted to having one of these accounts in Singapore of all places. And again, he never really provided a real good explanation why the hell you need a numbered bank account. So there was a lot of things like that that were just very, very suspicious with Sheridan Peterson. So you can see why me digging into him, looking at him, the aerospace parachutist, the Boeing connection, the shadiness and shit like that, from missing passport visa stamps to numbered bank accounts to just, crazy stunts, skydiving, experimenting with bat wings and all kinds of crazy shit. It just got me thinking, this has got to be the fucking guy. I mean, it has to be the guy. Eventually, though, it came to a point where I just thought, you know what, here's the problem. The problem came with the tie, because as the tie evidence was developed, and this has been going on for a long time, as the tie evidence was developed, the particles and stuff that came from the tie, and this is primarily initially through the work of Tom Kay and his group, the Citizen Sleuths, it became harder and harder to explain, well, if Sheridan Peterson was D.B. Cooper and that was his tie, how the fuck did he get that stuff on his tie? I mean, it became really, really difficult because there wasn't an easy explanation, even though the guy worked at Boeing. Especially as we got into some of this more exotic kind of stuff on the tie, it got to be real problematic. The other thing is that Sheridan Peterson left Boeing, like I said, in 1964. Now, the tie itself was manufactured in 1964 and was likely purchased in 1964 or maybe even 1965. Now, I want to say that in the past I have misspoken, and I said that Sheridan left for Asia in 1962 or something like that, for Southeast Asia in 1962, specifically the Philippines initially. That is not true. He actually left in 1965. I was looking at some materials today and it refreshed my memory about some stuff. He was in the United States until 1965. So yes, he could have purchased the tie while he was here in the United States, because again, the tie, by the time Sheridan left, D.B. Cooper, the real D.B. Cooper, whoever this guy was, already, in all likelihood, already owned the tie, already had the tie. But the problem is okay, like he was like helping like freedom fighters in the Deep South because he was kind of really into the civil rights vibe and thing and everything else. I'm like, well, I mean, like that's not exactly the environment where you start getting titanium and alloys and rare earth elements and all this kind of crazy shit on your tie. And again, he was gone from Boeing, in 64. And it's like, well, unless he somehow picked some of the stuff up at the very tail end of his tenure at Boeing, maybe that could explain some of it, but it really couldn't explain all of it. So eventually, that kind of got me thinking, yeah, if you can't, again, it's like I've said before, if you can't explain the tie, then you're not the guy, I mean, that's just it. If you can't explain the tie, then he's just not the guy. And, that's kind of been my mantra all along. If the physical evidence can't be accounted for, then he's just not the guy, even though there are a lot of things that sort of check the boxes as far as that goes. And ultimately, that coupled with the fact that he had very thinning hair on the top of his head by the time 1971 rolled around. He wasn't bald. I've heard him said he was bald. He wasn't bald. He had thin hair, was getting quite thin. I think it was a little too thin, though. It's just a little too thin. Even if he grew it out a little longer or whatever, it's just a little too thin. Now, Sheridan Peterson had bright blue eyes. Honestly, who gives a fuck? I mean, the dude was wearing sunglasses, so who the fuck knows? I know Florence Schaffner, saw him without his sunglasses at the very beginning of the flight before the jet was actually being skyjacked. She took his drink order, probably caught a fleeting glimpse of his face while she's writing down his drink order along with everybody else on the jet. And she said that she recalled DB Cooper's eyes as being brown. So, that obviously wouldn't be Sheridan Peterson's color because he had, sort of these bright blue eyes. But, it's something that's worth considering here is that maybe she made a mistake. The FBI file itself says that DB Cooper possibly had brown eyes. And the other thing that's very interesting to consider here is that Mark Meltzer goes by 377, who's a member of the DB Cooper Mystery Group, and I encourage everybody who's not a member of the DB Cooper Mystery Group to become a member of the DB Cooper Mystery Group on Facebook. Mark Meltzer, who is a longtime criminal defense attorney, he's mentioned that that when people are describing bad guys, like victims are describing bad guys, he said oftentimes they're described as having dark eyes, even though oftentimes they have blue eyes or green eyes or what have you, something other than dark eyes. So, and I think the reason why is because dark is just sort of a more sinister look, a more sinister color. So you can see how maybe Florence Schaffner thinking back on, oh yeah, I saw the guy's eyes, this skyjacker guy, whatever. Your mind can play tricks on you and kind of ascribe attributes like maybe darker eyes when they really weren't. And again, she just had a fleeting glimpse. I mean, she wasn't staring into his, baby blue eyes or anything like that. I mean, she's just taking fucking drink orders there. So at the end of the day, that he had blue eyes, I've never really considered that a deal breaker or whatever. I certainly can't eliminate somebody for having blue eyes. The FBI also didn't eliminate somebody for having blue eyes because Sheridan Peterson was one of the 8 guys they DNA tested, knowing full well, the FBI knew full well he had fucking blue eyes. So obviously, take that as you make of it what you will. I do think the hair thing is a lot harder to conceal though, like the thinning hair and stuff like that. It's kind of hard to explain that. But in totality, I think that's just what I came down to. Is I came down to the conclusion that he just can't be the guy because he cannot explain the stuff on the tie. It gets a little bit tricky. Who knows what the hell was going into Paul, the missing visa stamp or whatever. Maybe he's just, maybe he was so far off the grid, he's like, fuck it, I'm not going to Kathmandu this time to update the visa. They're going to have to, hunt my, lily white ass down at the base of the Himalayan mountains. He knew damn well nobody was going to do that. So maybe it was that kind of thing. And then eventually he got to Kathmandu, which was a little bit of a trek. It was, I think, a couple hundred miles away from where he was. And then got a proper stamp. So maybe it's as simple as that. As far as the, secret numbered bank account thing in Singapore, maybe the reason for that was simply because the guy was using that account to write checks from and get them and turn military payment script, which is how these guys were getting paid. They were getting paid with military military script instead of cash, cold hard cash. He may have used that bank account to sort of write a check to basically, through the black market to end up getting cash, to end up getting greenbacks. So, there are some rational kind of explanations for that. So, ultimately that's what it came down to. I've been asked a lot about Sheridan Peterson over the years, and every time that History Channel show re-airs, which by the way, it re-aired yesterday, 4 o'clock Eastern on History Channel. Every time that happens, people reach out to me and, they're like, yeah, this guy sure looks like, DB Cooper, he's just sort of shady enough, and he kind of toys with the interviewer and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff there, and I'm just scratching the surface with the guy. But ultimately, he's a very, very intriguing guy. But I'm convinced at this point that Sheridan Peterson was not DB Cooper. you know, Coincidentally, he just checked a lot of fucking boxes. He didn't check all of them, but he checked a lot of boxes. One other thing I should note is he was 45 years old at the time of the skyjacking, which, kind of hits the sweet spot as far as that goes as well. So it's just everything sort of seemed to point to Sheridan Peterson or some dude like Sheridan Peterson, but I just don't think he was the guy. But as I've said before, he's one of those guys that I've been asked a lot about over the years. And so I think it's worth kind of revisiting him and talking about Sheridan Peterson or what have you. Mark Meltzer, the gentleman who I referenced earlier, the longtime criminal defense attorney, knew Sheridan Peterson personally, had actually met Sheridan on a couple of occasions, and found Sheridan to be a very interesting person. He had a mind he was a very, very well-read individual, very intelligent individual, and very socially conscious, very politically active, very politically aware. So he was a fascinating person. My dealings with him, he was just kind of a prick. He was kind of, he didn't much care for me because he knew that I was sort of like sniffing around his world and basically saying, I think you may be DB Cooper. And, he just didn't like that. So he pretty much, called me a motherfucker a couple times, whatever, which, and this is as an old guy. He was like in his 80s, 90, whatever, something like in his 90s, actually, basically telling me to go fuck myself. But which was cool. I don't care. I didn't lose any sleep over it. But yeah, but he was a strange guy. He was a strange cat. There was almost like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, sort of aspect to his personality. And Mark Meltzer can attest to the fact as well that Sheridan during moments of reflection could reference the fact that there's a side of him that nobody really knows, which again is another one of those very intriguing things. Well, what the fuck exactly do you mean when you say that, Sheridan? It was very interesting. So finally, I'll say that he did write a book called The Idiot's Frightful Laughter that is basically a biography. It talks about his time in Vietnam and some of the stuff that he saw there. And it's fair to say that he was radicalized by what he saw in Vietnam. Not radicalized against the Vietnamese, he was radicalized against the Americans. He thought the Americans basically were committing war crimes using, white phosphor to burn people in villages and shit like that. And he was really, really upset with the United States government, the United States military. So as far as the guy who had a grudge or a chip on his shoulder, whatever the hell you want to say, Sheridan Peterson was definitely your guy as far as that goes. So let me, that's Sheridan Peterson. Very, very interesting guy. I'm glad I got a chance to speak with him and talk to him during his lifetime. I don't think he was DB Cooper, but he's a big part of the story. He's a big part of the DB Cooper mystery. So let me segue into Vince Peterson now. Vince Peterson came about. I won't go into all the details with respect to Vince Peterson because I've already been talking here, close to 39 minutes here, and I typically like to keep these things to about an hour in length. But Vince Peterson is a very intriguing individual because the way he was ultimately developed as a person of interest for me was through the tie particles, the science. And ultimately, the more I looked at the tie particles, and specifically there was an alloy, a titanium and antimony alloy, several particles of titanium and an antimony alloy that appeared to tie specifically in with a company called Rem Crew Titanium, which later became Crucible Steel. And through my conversations with former supervisors there and the president of, one of the spin-off companies, because Crucible eventually broke up, there were a lot of people that I talked to, and basically it appeared that DB Cooper, whoever this guy was, based upon the particles, the stuff that's on the tie, which includes a couple thousand pieces or particles of titanium on the tie. Again, this is from the late 60s, which titanium was rare back in the late 60s. It isn't like it is today where it's in wedding bands and frying pans and everything else. It was rare back then, and it was primarily used in the aerospace sector and in the chemical industry as well. So the fact that DB Cooper had a lot of titanium on his tie is pretty damn intriguing. It's really, really intriguing. And it's not titanium, dioxide from paint, or used to make paint white or something like that. It's actual titanium. In fact, Tom Kay, who's a well-known researcher, of course, he has a spectacular image of this, like this little titanium, really small titanium bar, for lack of a better word, that's on his Citizen Sleuth's website. A really high quality image. That's actual fucking titanium. Why that that image is so important is because I later, looking at it, identified it as acicular titanium powder. So it appears that a number of the titanium particles that were on DB Cooper's tie were actually from powder metallurgy, titanium powder metallurgy, which was only being researched and developed in the 1960s and 1970s before it finally became commercially viable in the 1980s, well after the skyjacking. So looking at the totality of all the tie particle evidence, titanium and antimony, powdered metals, salt, all these kind of things, I became quite certain that, quite convinced that DB Cooper came from this titanium research lab at Crucible Steel. And of course, there's a story with respect to that. I mean, Vince Petersen was one of a very small number of engineers who actually worked in this lab, and it's the engineers who wore ties. The assistants who helped all along, the assistants, I'll get that image back up. Yeah, forget about it. The assistants who were helping all along, they didn't wear ties. They didn't wear ties to work. So it appears it's just the engineers and the supervisors who wore ties. And obviously DB Cooper was wearing a freaking tie. So like that's why Vince Petersen was, part of what intrigued me about Vince Petersen. The other thing was just the physical attributes of Vince Petersen. Vince Petersen, 6'1", he was thin. If you look at, and unfortunately the image has gone away here, but if you look at, he has kind of the high forehead which resembles the initial sketch, the Bing Crosby sketch. So there is enough of a resemblance there where I'm like, this guy is very, very intriguing. And the more I started digging into Vince Petersen and looking at, Vince Petersen's background or whatever, it became apparent to me that he worked on the very things, he worked in the very division on the very particles and the very things that were ended up being on DB Cooper's tie. So it's very, again, it's very intriguing as far as that is concerned. Also, very importantly, I talked to the supervisor who's still around. I don't know if he's still around now, but he's in his 90s when I last spoke with him. And this was a couple of years ago. He's actually the one who gave me Vince Petersen's name. He's the one who said, sounds like Vince Petersen, because I said, we're looking for somebody who's around, 50, who's around 6'1", and, titanium. And he said, sounds like Vince Petersen. Vince Petersen was 6'1". Vince Petersen was 52 years of age at the time of the skyjacking, which I think fits right into the age range that DB Cooper should be in there. He was thin, he didn't have a big beer belly or whatever, so he was a fit guy as far as that goes. He would hike, and he had fishing and hunting licenses, and I've seen, even into the 80s, he had fishing and hunting licenses. I got a Nexus Lexus report on the guy, so I know his property holdings. I know his fishing licenses and hunting licenses and stuff. I mean, he was an active person even well past all this stuff. So there was a lot that really kind of intrigued me about him as far as all that goes. And I hate to say this, but if you look at pictures of Vince Peterson as well, he's not he's not an overly handsome man. I'm not trying to disparage him or speak ill of him. He passed away in 2002, but I mean, there's no arguing he wasn't, Cary Grant or, George Clooney or somebody like that. He wasn't a particularly, handsome man is how I would put it. And that's how the flight attendants described DB Cooper as not being a particularly good looking fella. So make of that what you will, but so that there's that part of it that checks the box too. So, and he was also, Vince Peterson was also very MacGyverish. I mean, he was the kind of guy where if there was a problem with the lights in the house that weren't working, or he needed something done at the house, he didn't bother hiring a skilled tradesman to do whatever needed to be done. He went to the library and read up on it, and then he did it, himself, and kind of a half-assed job, actually. And the reason I know that is because the guy who bought his house, Vince Peterson's house, from him and from Vince Peterson's wife, still owns the house, and I've been to the house, and I know the guy very well, and I've had a lengthy, and the guy happened to be a general contractor, and he talked about the pretty shoddy sort of work that Vince Peterson did with respect to this. Also talking to the neighbors about Vince Peterson, he was one of those guys. He was kind of to himself. He was kind of to himself a lot. And it's not that he was completely antisocial, whatever. But I mean, there were conversations that neighbors had with him that they conveyed to me that he was just he just, like I said, he was just a little bit of an odd duck in a way as far as that's concerned. I think he just didn't feel overly comfortable in social setting. There's a dweebiness to the guy, if you will, as far as that goes. So again, which I think kind of sort of comports with the DB Cooper that I believe is kind of, as we know him, the way he was described and everything else, the giddiness of getting the cash and everything else. So there's a lot there that is really intriguing with respect to Vince Peterson. And to be sure, I talked with his son, actually met his son, and I talked with his daughter, and his daughter, who has been very adamant that her father was not DB Cooper, and again tells me I can go fuck myself, because I think I've basically said her father may well be DB Cooper based upon the research and the evidence and everything as far as I understand it. But having said that, he's always a very compelling person of interest based strictly upon that kind of stuff. One of the other things, and I'm kind of just like throwing all this stuff out there. One of the other things that was very interesting that I forgot to mention as well is that Vince Peterson, when I asked the supervisor of that division, I said, I assume that you visited Boeing on occasion, because Boeing was a major contractor of, or Rem Crucible was a major subcontractor for Boeing. They supplied Boeing the majority of their metals that were used on the airplanes, like titanium and that kind of stuff. And the supervisor said yes, that he would actually kind of make the rounds and visit the clients, the companies, including Boeing in Seattle. And I said, did anybody else ever do that with you? And he said there was only one person who ever did that with me or solo, and that was Vince Peterson. So I know with certainty that Vince Peterson had actually been to Boeing on multiple occasions on the production floor, talking with their engineers about crucible steel products and everything related to that. So that was also a very important piece of the puzzle in my mind. I'm thinking, here's a guy who obviously has some familiarity with Boeing, the Seattle region, all of that stuff, the 727, but doesn't actually live there and everything else, doesn't actually work at Boeing, which kind of checks a lot of the boxes in my mind. One of the other things that I've also found very interesting too about Petersen is that, first of all, there's a couple of things here. First of all, is that his wife, he met his wife in Washington D.C. I guess Petersen lived in D.C. for a period of time and met his wife, and his wife worked of all places at the FBI. She worked for the FBI. Now this would have been in the it must have been the 1950s. It must have been the early 1950s or early to mid 1950s. I'm not exactly sure, but this was before they had female FBI agents. But nonetheless, she worked at the FBI in the fingerprint division. That's an intriguing thing to contemplate as well, because D.B. Cooper apparently didn't leave any fingerprints behind. Because, even though the authorities came up with, a handful of fingerprints that were on the plane from obviously different individuals or whatever, D.B. Cooper apparently wasn't overly conspicuous about that. Like, it appears that D.B. Cooper didn't leave his fingerprints behind. And I don't know if he wiped everything down when he was in the back by himself. I don't know if he put super glue or something on his fingertips. I'm not sure what happened there, but it apparently was pretty effective. And, it is just sort of an intriguing tidbit that, your wife worked at the FBI fingerprint division, when you met her. So that's kind of a really, really interesting thing as far as that is concerned. And there was one other thing I was going to say about that. Oh, I know what I was also going to say as well, is that the timing. Vince Petersen initially worked at the Crucible Steel operation in Midland, Pennsylvania, which is right on the, I don't know, Ohio River, I guess. I think it's kind of like on the border between, I think it's Ohio and Pennsylvania there. But then Crucible opened up a new facility in Robinson Township, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh, which is, an hour and a half away, something like that, hour away. They opened that building, they opened that facility in 1964. 1964, I think, is a pivotal year in the D.B. Cooper case. The tie was manufactured, the 727 first flew, entered air service. The Robinson Township, that's when the Titanium Research Lab was founded and started there in 1964. Vince Petersen started there, so he moved his family to that area, the Robinson Township area, Pittsburgh area, bought a home and everything in 1964. So I always thought, well, okay, maybe you buy a new tie at the same time, and that would have been exactly when the tie was available to purchase there. There was a brand new JCPenney superstore there at one of the major malls there in the Pittsburgh area. So like I can identify the place where he could have actually bought the tie. So there's a lot of things like that just sort of added up as far as Vince Petersen's concerned. Now, Vince Petersen, as far as I know, was never a cigarette smoker, just as Sheridan Peterson was also apparently never a cigarette smoker. But what's intrigued me about that is that you never really know. You don't know. I mean, I don't know if he smoked when he was in the Merchant Marines or something like that, because Petersen was in the Merchant Marines. But what I found very interesting is he had his son, whom I met, who actually met face to face. Vince Petersen would actually buy his son, while he was underage, he would buy him cigarettes. He would buy him packs of cigarettes. So I thought, well, that's interesting. That's intriguing. So he's not a smoker himself, but he's buying his, I don't know, 17-year-old kid packs of cigarettes or whatever. It's just it's just off enough where it's like, how much do we really fucking know? You know what I'm saying? It's just an odd thing. And I know this happened because the son and Julie also told me. They have told me that this happened. So I know this happened. So the things that people would argue that go against Vince Petersen would be the fact that he has blue eyes. I don't think they're not like bright blue eyes like Sheridan Peterson or whatever, but they had blue eyes. So they're going to be people who bring that up. And of course, I've addressed that. They're also going to say that it was his right hand, his pinky, the top little nobular of his right pinky was missing. Uh, some kind of accident or something. So the top little thing was there. His basically his nail was gone. That like sort of the top part was just gone. So people said, well, it would be obvious. You could easily see that, and I'm like, that's like fucking stupid. No, you wouldn't obviously see that. Again, you got to remember this is a fucking skyjacking taking place. The flight attendant's not staring him down and sizing him up. Moreover, it was his right hand that was in the goddamn bomb the whole fucking time. So how the hell is she going to see his, unless she's got like X-ray eyes or something like that. Moreover, his daughter said that Julie said that it was unnoticeable. Basically, she actually sent me pictures, and like, unless you're really zeroing in on the fucking hand, you're not gonna notice. It's not like he's got half his fucking hand missing or something. It's just the fingertip part, the fingernail part of his right pinky, which again was the hand that was constantly in the bomb. He was smoking cigarettes, presumably with his left hand, and the flight attendant was Tina Mucklow was sitting to his left, so he was smoking with his left hand. His right hand was in the attaché case, the bomb that was sitting in the window seat. So again, that's one of those things that I think it's people just trying to make much ado about very little as far as that is concerned. You certainly can't eliminate somebody just because of that. And of course, he's a white guy. Now, D.B. Cooper was described as being a guy who he was described as white. He was described as having a darker complexion, maybe of Latin, Mexican American heritage or Native American heritage. Actually, the Mexican American, Native American heritage came from the same guy. That description came from one witness. He's described as having a swarthy complexion, an olive complexion, what have you. So, again, somebody who spends time outdoors, you get a little bit of sun or whatever the case may happen to be. I think there you've got your olive complexion there. So I don't know how much we can really read into that. You can't eliminate somebody just because some people said that he had an olive complexion or swarthy complexion, and the guy's Eric Eulis white. You know what I'm saying? I mean, again, I get out in the sun and get some suntan, and I'm going to definitely have a darker complexion for a white guy, just for no other reason than I spent some time in the sun. I was outdoors, and I'm not alone on that. A lot of white people are like that. So again, who the hell really knows? It's you just can't eliminate for people because of that. And I'm trying to think of what else. I've heard people say that it was sort of out of character. He was a nice guy, and it just doesn't mesh with his character, or whatever. And I'm like, he was an odd guy. He was arguably an odd guy. And these aren't my words. This isn't me saying this. This is people who knew him, neighbors and that kind of thing, that described him as kind of an odd duck. Doesn't make you fucking D.B. Cooper, but it also doesn't make you the fucking Pope. So listen, make of that what you will. All I know is that he was a very bright guy. He was an accomplished guy. And who the hell knows? One thing, as I'm talking about it, one thing that's very interesting to me is I recall that there was one of his neighbors mentioning to me that there was a period of time in the early 70s. He couldn't remember when exactly it was, but he says it was the very early 70s when he grew a beard. Vince Petersen actually grew a fucking beard, which is weird because if you see the dude, he's kind of, pretty clean cut conservative looking. It's like, what would possess the guy to grow a beard? But he actually grew a beard. That's one of those things that I always thought, like, was that part of the plan? I mean, did D.B. Cooper, have a beard and, fly to Portland, got to Portland somehow, fly to Portland, and then, before he obviously boarded 305, went into the stall in the restroom and shaved. Just simply shaved that off. I mean, because that's all it takes to dramatically change your appearance. Like nobody knows how DB Cooper got to the airport. No, in Portland, he just kind of appeared out of thin air. Nobody recognized the guy. So I think it stands to reason that he probably altered his appearance in some way. Maybe he changed his hair to a different side. Maybe he shaved. Maybe he had a bright, neon green, wide neon green tie and replaced it with a conservative black one. Maybe he was wearing a hat and decided and then got rid of the hat. Who the fuck knows? But he did something. It seems like he changed his or altered his appearance in some way, whereby as time has gone by, when the authorities interviewed people, nobody could say, "Yeah, I remember seeing the guy," either on a bus or a taxi cab or on. I don't know how much they interviewed people, flight attendants from other flights or what have you. I'm really unaware of them really doing much of any of that. But the point of the matter is that it's really really interesting to consider the fact that he had that beard, that Vince Peterson had that beard, the one and only time he had a fucking beard, early 70s. We couldn't pin the exact year or whatever, but I'm like, okay, I mean 71, okay. The other thing is that I don't know whether Vince Peterson experienced any kind of financial duress or what have you, related to all the tumult that took place in the aerospace sector, the aerospace industry, in 1971. But it just seems to me, I've said this before, it just seems to me that DB Cooper, something motivated this guy to sort of go postal, like to skyjack the jet. And it seems to me like there had to be some sort of economic duress or something had to happen there. He got furloughed, he got laid off, he got fired, something had to happen. It just seems like that would be the case. And it's well documented that the metals industry in Western Pennsylvania experienced a depression, just like Boeing experienced a depression in 1971 specifically. And I know specifically Western Pennsylvania, like I've read New York Times articles that say, that there were like 45,000 men that were either idled or out of work or what have you during that period of time as a result of basically the government cutting funding on the SST project and a number of other things that led to basically a collapse of the metals industry, the steel industry, and the specialty metals, titanium industry, and everything else there, and obviously Boeing as well. So that's, I don't know if this impacted Vince Peterson specifically, but it's not beyond the realm of possibilities that it impacted him because he worked at the fucking company, one of the companies that experienced a lot of tumult and turmoil. So it's just a really intriguing thing to consider. Now, ultimately, the reason I came out a few months ago and said I don't think Vince Peterson could be the guy was because of three particles that came in the latest retesting of the stub 675. Specifically, there are a couple particles of uranium and a couple particles of thorium that appear to indicate that there is some sort of nuclear connection to it, whether it's nuclear energy or what have you, that kind of connection. And there was no apparent connection between crucible steel and the nuclear industry or the Atomic Energy Commission or what have you around that time. So it's like, again, like I said, if you can't explain all the particles on the tie, then you got to cut bait. You can't be a homer, you got to cut bait. You got to be intellectually honest about it. And I'm like, I can't figure out how Vince Peterson or anybody at Crucible could have got that stuff on their tie, the thorium and uranium and all that kind of stuff. So ultimately that led me to conclude that likely that Vince Peterson likely wasn't DB Cooper, and that DB Cooper likely did not come from Crucible Steel. So that's ultimately the reason that happened there. So Having said that, as we're kind of getting to the end of this thing here, I do want to say once again in closing here that I'm going to be doing another YouTube live. Again, it'll be 6 p.m. Pacific time this coming Thursday, so in 2 days, where I've got a big reveal, big new information related to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and specifically the thorium and uranium particles and everything else. I happen to have an uncle who is a nuclear engineer. He has colleagues who worked at Oak Ridge. So fortunately, I've been able to lean into them and have them take a look at it as experts, take a look at this data and tell me what's going on here. And I'm going to tell you what they told me. It's, I think, a pretty big deal, pretty important stuff. So I will be, how's that for a tease? I'll be taking that up again coming YouTube live this Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific, again, 9 o'clock on the East Coast. So if anybody in the last couple minutes here wants to ask a question or what have you, feel free to type in a question. I know there have been some comments that I haven't really had a chance to read just because I was talking, filibustering, talking, wasn't letting anybody get a word in edgewise. But if there are any questions anybody has about either Sheridan Peterson or Vince Petersen here in this, let's say this last 5 minutes, this is your time. This is your time to throw them out there. But I'll say while I'm waiting for somebody to comment, if they want to comment or ask a question, that I think, one of the things that I really try to do here with all of my stuff, whether it's the Facebook Live stuff I do as part of the DB Cooper Mystery Group, or whether it's on my YouTube channel, is I want to, good luck, Eric. All right, Mark, I'm going to put my glasses on, by the way, so I can read. But what I try to do here is, like, this is your opportunity to actually follow in real time my research and my investigation. So you get to kind of go with the ups and downs. You get to see basically how my mind thinks and how the evidence is and stuff is developed and coming in, and just sort of like I'm walking people through in real time this investigation, at least my investigation. So I think that's, I hope that there are people that kind of enjoy that part, and because right now, as it stands right now, DB Cooper is still a mystery. We still don't know who the guy is. And there are some intriguing people and persons of interest out there, to be sure, but it's an ever-evolving investigation, I guess, is probably the way to put it here. And I do think when all is said and done, I've said this before, that we're going to figure out who this guy is, who this guy was. I think we're going to figure out who this guy was, because science is advancing quite rapidly, and we've got a lot to work with here, that I think will help us identify who this guy was. So let's get a question or two up there. Don't be shy. Let's get a question or two up there. Fire away. There's got to be somebody who likes likes one of these two men, or maybe doesn't like them, or what have you. Again, and I kind of just sort of scratched on the surface of these two guys. I mean, there's a lot more to each one of these two men that intrigue me as viable, credible, persons of interest in the DB Cooper case. I think that they were, and could either one of them be DB Cooper? Yeah, I can't eliminate either one of them, really. I mean, because maybe there is some sort of, tortured explanation for a few of the things that I can't really explain. That's possible, crazy shit happens. But I mean, so I've just said that it's just kind of unlikely, but I don't know. We'll see how this all develops. But it's an ever evolving, like I said, investigation, everything. So anybody have any questions? Anybody have any comments or whatever? Feel free to plug that up here. I'll give it. Sheridan is interesting. Sheridan is very interesting. He's an interesting guy. Doesn't make him DB Cooper, of course. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but I mean, there's just no smoking gun. Like I said, I always said that I was 98% convinced that he was DB Cooper, but by definition, that means there's that missing 2%. I've never been able to close the deal, and that's all it takes. I mean, when you're dealing with a country of back then in 1971, I don't know, 200 million Americans, half of which are men. And, you've got basically, several 100,000 men that, are credible, could be suspects. I mean, there are going to be a few that are the 1 in 100,000 kind of freak anomaly kind of thing. So, Jay asked about turkey neck. Bill Mitchell references the turkey neck kind of thing. Let's talk, and I'll briefly mention the turkey neck thing. I think the turkey neck thing, which is only mentioned by Bill Mitchell, is a little bit exaggerated in these discussions, and because people are literally looking for some guy who's got an obvious turkey neck gobble kind of thing going down there. And if it was that obvious, then why did nobody else reference it? I think what happened here is that DB Cooper was slouched, because he was literally slouched in his chair. He was a 6'1" guy, so a pretty tall guy for someone of that generation, but he was kind of slouched down. He was kind of slouched down, and I think when you slouch down like that, I think that that will kind of, if you're looking at from a profile perspective, which what Bill Mitchell was doing, I think that can definitely give you the appearance of a little bit of a turkey gobble or whatever the case may happen to be. So that's kind of my explanation for it. The guy standing up properly, standing up, talking properly, may well have had nothing at all, because again, it's just really remarkable that nobody else, Tina Mucklow, nobody described a turkey gobble, but Bill Mitchell did. Bill Mitchell was a then 20-year-old college student who was, sizing up DB Cooper, his profile, not knowing he was a skyjacker, but, so, and he described him as having, kind of a saggy chin. I think it's the exact phrase that's used in his 302 is a saggy chin, which again, I think in my mind can be accounted for merely by virtue of the fact that DB Cooper was apparently slouching in his chair. So that's how I would describe it there. So any last questions as far as that goes? In other words, don't eliminate somebody because they don't have a big old fucking saggy turkey gobble neck thing. Like, you can't eliminate somebody because they don't have that. So, yeah. And, and it's worth noting, DB Cooper was basically a fit guy. I mean, he was just, he was basically in shape, He had jet black hair as well. So, I don't know if he had, if he dyed his hair or whatever, but could the witnesses be thinking of another passenger and not Cooper? Everyone was wearing the same sort of clothes. He blended in. Actually, he wasn't wearing the same sort of clothes. And this is what Hal Williams, the gate agent, noticed about DB Cooper. Hal Williams, who I think is actually one of the most valuable witnesses, actually noted that part of what made DB Cooper stand out, aside from the fact that the rest of the passengers were kind of congregating on the sides or what have you, and he was off to the side. DB Cooper was off to himself by the side. Is that DB Cooper was all in black. He was rolling like Johnny fucking Cash there. He had black hair, black tie, black jacket, black shoes, black attaché case, black slacks. He was all in black. He was dressed in all black. And he said that that's what made him kind of stand out because, again, this is 1971, which was kind of, the big wide ties with the yellows and the neon greens and all that colorful kind of shit, a couple years past the Summer of Love vibe thing. And DB Cooper looked a little bit dated, a little bit out of place, but, he was again, the man in black, all in black, like I said, rolling like Johnny Cash there. So, and there was a comment that I just saw briefly about these guys are worth looking at. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. DB Cooper, 53 years out, still an enigma, still a mystery. We don't know who the guy is. It's for a reason. And I've said many times before that I think that when we figure out who DB Cooper actually was, I'm being optimistic here, when we figure out who this guy actually was, that he's gonna look like 85% of kind of what we expected him to look like. We're gonna see a picture of him. We're gonna see him and kind of know about him. And it's like, yeah, that's 85% of kind of what we expected. But there's gonna be that 15% that's just off. There's gonna be that 15%. Maybe it was the blue eyes. Maybe I don't know. Maybe he had lighter hair, but he had dyed it jet black. I mean, there's going to be stuff like there. Maybe he wasn't of Latin heritage or whatever. Maybe he was a pretty white dude. After all, it's worth noting that our good friend Martin McNally, who skyjacked the jet several months after D.B. Cooper, and actually jumped from a 727 and got away. He got caught several days later because he talked and spent 40 years in prison, or something close to 40 years in prison. Martin McNally was actually, when it came time for the witnesses to describe Martin McNally, he was described as being like perhaps being Latin. Well, this guy is whiter than me. He was, McNally is, what was that, like fucking Scottish or something like that, heritage? He's a white dude, totally white dude. There's not a drop of like Latin DNA in his veins or Native American DNA. Yet he was described as, being Latin. And again, I think part of that, it's kind of like the brown eyes thing, bad guys, you just sort of ascribe sort of, dark features to, because our mind just kind of plays tricks with us. And, that was an era, 1971, where you got a lot of those, take me to Cuba kind of things going on. So when you hear of a skyjacking, or if you're on a jet that's being skyjacked and there's the bad guy skyjacking the jet with black hair or whatever, you catch a fleeting glimpse or whatever, or, oh yeah, I vaguely remember seeing a guy, you're going to kind of naturally, I think a lot of times people are going to kind of think of him as, yeah, he looked like fucking Zorro. Yeah, he kind of looked like he was Latin heritage or whatever. Meanwhile, he's just some rando fucking white dude who basically needed a couple $100K. I mean, that's just kind of it, from Pittsburgh, or whatever. So, or, Des Moines, Iowa, or some such place, or whatever the case may happen to be. So, again, that's why I think we have to be really, really careful about it, why we eliminate people, because it can bite us in the ass. So, all right, I think I'm going to go ahead and end it at that. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to visit with me. Again, don't miss this Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. Eastern time. I've got some big, bold new information that relates to Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the uranium and the thorium and some of the particles and stuff that have come out of the new testing of stub 675. And this is from experts. This isn't just Eric Eulis talking here. These are experts that can kind of speak to that, and I think it reveals and sheds a lot of light on D.B. Cooper. So, and where he may or may not have come from. So very, very worthwhile listen to. So, all right, folks, thanks again. Appreciate it. And hope you have a good evening, and cheers.